When the earliest field reports arrived announcing that Vladimir Putin had opened the embattled approaches to Pokrovsk to all journalists, including Ukrainian ones, the strategic intention behind the move was unmistakably chilling. This was no gesture of humanitarian concern. It was a meticulously calibrated act of geopolitical theater, turning the brutal reality of the battlefield into a stark, unavoidable spectacle. The Kremlin was inviting the world to witness the very truths Western capitals had spent years insisting were false. The Ukrainian army, celebrated for its resilience, appeared cornered, depleted, and steadily losing ground. No cascade of soaring speeches from Washington or Brussels, no new tranche of military aid hurriedly approved by parliaments, could alter the merciless arithmetic unfolding on that isolated front line. Pokrovsk was no longer simply a city. It had become the pressure chamber of collapse, a crucible where political fantasy was forced into direct collision with the unyielding force of power. For months, Western commentators repeated hopeful stories of Ukrainian breakthroughs, Russian fragility, and impending strategic reversals that stubbornly refused to materialize. But by the end of 2025, the battlefield told a profoundly different story. Pokrovsk, a modest logistical node in Ukraine's Donetsk region, now stood as a monument to cumulative exhaustion. The Russian military, having absorbed the harsh lessons of its early missteps, abandoned reckless sweeping assaults in favor of a slow, grinding strategy of encirclement, the classic doctrine of attrition. Their goal was not merely to undermine morale. It was to systematically dismantle Ukraine's capacity to continue the fight. Western planners, trapped in a cycle driven by media narratives rather than material conditions, fundamentally misunderstood this shift. They treated war as a contest of inspiring stories rather than a struggle governed by industrial output, manpower, and physical control of territory. Yet power, as students of geopolitics have insisted for generations, is measured not in rhetoric but in capabilities, the real, tangible balance of force. By inviting international journalists to observe Ukraine's encircled troops, Moscow was not promoting transparency. It was asserting supremacy. Putin's ominous comparison of Pokrovsk to Mariupol or the siege of Azovstal was a deliberate warning to Kiev. Patterns of defeat, once set in motion, tend to repeat themselves. He understood a fundamental truth of statecraft. Perception does not merely flow from diplomacy, it actively shapes it. Once the world sees undeniable collapse with its own eyes, political consequences become irreversible. Putin knew precisely what the cameras would capture. The hollowed faces of exhausted soldiers, the empty trails of shattered supply routes, the grim desperation of units receiving Western aid too late and in quantities too small to matter. And as those images circulated globally, the political logic within Europe would inevitably shift. Realism, buried for years beneath layers of moralistic rhetoric, would once again assert its cold authority. The tragedy of Pokrovsk reaches far beyond military terms. It holds civilizational significance. The West's unyielding insistence on pursuing an increasingly unattainable victory accelerated not only the erosion of Ukrainian statehood, but also the unraveling of the West's own credibility. This stage was not set by Russian propaganda, it was prepared by Western denial. Every war reaches a moment when illusions collapse. Pokrovsk was the place where that collapse began. What disintegrated there was not merely a defensive perimeter but an entire worldview. From the beginning, Western leaders framed the Ukraine war not as a complex geopolitical confrontation but as a moral saga, democracy versus autocracy, light against darkness. It was an emotionally compelling framework, but one that doomed the strategy. From the start, wars are not decided by moral symbolism. They are determined by capabilities, geography, and endurance. The liberal West, steeped in post-Cold War confidence, had forgotten these unforgiving truths. It believed economic sanctions, information warfare, and global condemnation could substitute for hard power. What began in 2022 as a bold effort to weaken Russia had, by 2025, evolved into a conflict that exposed the West's own strategic decay. Pokrovsk became the bitter consequence of that hubris, the arena where the iron logic of power crushed the fragile illusions of ideology. Washington and its European allies made a critical miscalculation. They mistook moral certainty for strategic clarity. By expanding NATO and heavily arming Ukraine, Western planners assumed they could deter Russia without ever risking direct confrontation. They catastrophically underestimated Moscow's resolve, its ability to adapt under pressure, and its capacity to endure immense costs for what it perceives as an existential national interest. To Russia, NATO's expansion and the militarization of Ukraine were not abstract policy decisions. They were existential threats. Yet Western policymakers, steeped in the assumptions of liberal hegemony, dismissed these fears as propaganda. They clung to a worldview in which stated intentions mattered more than lived perceptions, and in which international rules could override the raw mechanics of power. But those illusions had consequences. By 2024, the costs became unsustainable. Ukraine's manpower collapsed to critical levels. Its infrastructure was shattered, its air defense systems were thinning to the point of irrelevance. Meanwhile, Western aid, once abundant, slowed dramatically as domestic political pressures surged. Elections, economic crises, and ideological fatigue eroded the coalition that once spoke with unified resolve. Pokrovsk's encirclement was no anomaly, it was the predictable outcome of a war fought against the grain of reality.